This is the Whimsy Farm Podcast. I'm Carolyn Crane.
There's a big wide world right out your door. Good people doing good things. Whoa, it's a big wide world. Now is the time. Now is our time.
Welcome, everyone. Today I talk with best-selling biographer Larry Tye. His latest effort is The Jazzmen, How Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, and Count Basie Transformed America. And because jazz reminds me of poetry, our resident poet and poetry expert Maryam Barrie will join us after we hear from Larry Tye. She and I will share poems about jazz and the Black experience on Poetry Sustains. First, let's welcome Larry Tye. Welcome to the Whimsy Farm podcast today. Author Larry Tye. He wrote Jazzmen, among other books, and the subtitle is How Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, and Count Basie Transformed America. Welcome, Larry.
Great to be with you.
One thing I want to say, not really a question, but I just want to begin with this. It's one of the reasons I enjoyed the book so much. It's a fun read. I felt like not only were you an author, but you were also a conductor. You had these three musicians that you're writing about it, and you organize the book thematically. So it hops around like a piece, a sophisticated orchestral piece, and you've got the three main figures, and then their side men and their side women and their families, and all these characters coming in and out. And I felt like you handled it so masterfully. I could just picture you with a baton and as you organized all of this, and it really made it fun to read.
I love that image, and I think I should just let you talk because I love the way that you're seeing that musical metaphor as operating, and I hope that it did work at least in part that way, but also built around a central theme, which was a way to look at these guys beyond their lives as musicians. I don't pretend to be enough of a conductor or a musical expert to have told smart readers new things about their music, but about their lives off the bandstand, I think there was a lot new to be said.
And you said a lot. It's quite a comprehensive book. You write in the introduction, I think it is, that you had wanted to write this book for 25 years. Can you talk about why this was such a deep-seated, long interest of yours, and what made it finally happen when it happened?
Sure. It goes back to an earlier book I wrote about the Black men who worked on America's railroads, and they were called Pullman Porters. And the Pullman Porters that I interviewed told me wonderful stories about their lives on the railroad, how they had helped kickstart in many ways the civil rights movement, and how they had played a unique role in American history, but how they also, having started just after slavery, how they reflected the full history of Black life in America. And the Pullman Porters, when I got done interviewing them, made me promise that someday I would write two other books. One was on their favorite sports figure who they carried on the trains, who was a guy named Satchel Paige, a great Negro League pitcher. And I wrote that several years ago. But their three favorite passengers that all the porters I interviewed all eventually told me stories about their three favorite passengers, who were three guys named Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie. And the reason the Porters loved the Jazzmen and that the Jazzmen loved the Porters, to me, say a lot about what America was like in those days. That if you can picture when these three guys were at the height of their profession, they knew that if they went below the Mason-Dixon line and they made the wrong choice of a restaurant to try to get a meal in or a place to try to spend the night, they could end up being berated, being beaten, or if they went into a whites only establishment, they could end up at the end of a lynching noose. And too often that happened among blacks who made those bad decisions. And so what they did was when they went south, they would rent a private Pullman sleeping car, this elegant railroad car, to go with them. And if they were doing a concert, let's say in Atlanta, they would know at the end of the night they had a place to have a great meal cooked for them by the dining car staff. They had a plush bed made up for them by the Pullman porters. And most of all, they had a safe haven that they knew that nobody would bother them because the Pullman porters were watching out for them. And so, what they did in return, in the middle of the night, in this closed capsule of the railroad car, is they would perform a private concert for the Pullman porters and for the dining car guys. And I don't know about you, Carolyn, but if I could go back to any moment in history, it would be having the Duke Ellington Orchestra perform all night just for me.
That's an incredible image, and you talk a lot about the Pullman porters in the book, and I'm already looking forward to reading your book, Rising from the Rails, that talks about the Pullman porters more extensively. One of the things that interested me is you talked about how they had like a facade that the Pullman porters put on for people that was what their employers wanted them, and that was the ideal servant. And then that was a facade perhaps they could take off when they were hanging out with the Jazzmen?
So all black entertainers or um, people who were in a service industry in that era had to wear a mask. And the mask was that if they ever told the true feelings, if they ever really talk back in the same demeaning fashion to many of the whites who they were entertaining or serving, the way those whites responded to them, that they would get fired and they might get beaten up. And so they had to wear a mask. And that mask was something that they just without even thinking about, instinctively went into that mode of a bit of deception when they were around whites. And it was painful to have to wear the mask. It was demeaning to have to wear the mask. And it was essential in order to preserve their own livelihoods and lives. And it was just a function of what life was like in segregated Jim Crow America.
Mm. Reminds me of the Dunbar poem, of course.
Mm.
We wear the mask. Yeah, that's a powerful image. Let's talk a little bit about the childhoods of these three icons. They're very different. Um, Want to start with Duke?
Sure. So Duke Ellington grew up in the largest middle class black community in America in Washington, D.C. His dad was a servant. He often was a butler in the White House. His mother, because the father made a relatively speaking decent living back then, his mother often was free from work, and he lived in a series of nice houses all across the city of Washington. And the image that most sticks in my mind from his childhood and said what Duke was like and what his life was like was in the morning when he would walk down the steep staircase on his way to school, he would tell his young male cousins who were at the bottom of the steps, it's appropriate if you bow to me. I'm the great and the grand Duke Ellington. He told his young nieces it's okay to curtsy in response to me. And he told his uncles and aunts and his parents, someday the world is going to know me as the great Duke Ellington. And he had a sense from a very young age in the way he dressed and in the way he behaved that someday he would be part of American royalty, and he lived up to that. And he is the one, by the way, while he told great stories on all these friends who gave him the nickname Duke, I'm convinced he dubbed himself Duke. And again, That's because he knew what he was in store for. About 500 miles away in New Orleans, Louis Armstrong was growing up in a very different world. He grew up in a part of blacks only New Orleans that was so rough and tumble, it was known as the battlefield. His mother was a single mother. She worked hard to put food on the table, and Lewis grew up having a sense that unless he worked hard as well, going out and entertaining people in the streets of New Orleans, that there would be no food on the table for himself, for his mother, and for his younger sister. And his defining moment of his childhood was when, on New Year's Eve, when he was 13 years old, he had gotten a hold of his stepfather's pistol, and everybody in New Orleans, like in much of America, was trying to make as much noise as they can in celebrating New Year's Eve. And he shot the pistol in the air, and he very quickly felt the hand of the law on the scruff of his neck. A large detective from the New Orleans Police Department arrested him, sent him to the court, which sent him to a reform school known as the Colored Home for Waifs. And he spent months in reform school. And I think, and more importantly, he thought that if it weren't for being in reform school, he might have ended up like lots of the friends he was hanging out with in the streets of New Orleans who never lived beyond their teenage years. And he learned while he was in reform school in the philosophy of Booker T. Washington, one of the great black philosophers of that era. Washington said you have to learn as a young black to do one thing so well that the white world can never take it away from you. Louis Armstrong learned how to play a trumpet, then a cornet, then a bugle better than anyone else on the planet. So Ellington was seeing himself as royalty from a young age. Louis Armstrong was seeing that he had to do whatever it took to survive. And about 1,000 miles away, there was a kid named Billy Basie who was growing up in a community called Red Bank, New Jersey. And if your listeners have never been to Red Bank, I would tell them don't bother going there because there was only one thing really worth knowing about Red Bank, and that is that it was the birthplace of Count Basie. He grew up with his father being a gardener, his mother was a laundress, and they made a living, but they were sort of lower middle class. And Count Basie couldn't wait to get the heck out of Red Bank. And he initially thought about joining the circus as a quick way out of town. He decided that his musical skills were an even quicker way. He ended up making it to New York and learning how to play the piano at the feet of the great Fats Waller. And that was Bill Basie's beginning, and that was his way of escaping the world that he grew up in.
One of my favorite moments in the book is when it's toward the end, when Louis Armstrong, he's got this big hit, What a Wonderful World, and it gets some criticism. Some people are saying, how can you say this, Louis? How can you say this is a wonderful world? Look around you at all of the problems and chaos and crime and violence. And his response was not only charming, but it spoke of a deep-seated optimism that, given his rough beginning, is, I think, poignant. Can you talk a little bit about Louis Armstrong as an optimist?
So Louis Armstrong was about the only person that I can imagine in the world who could have talked about how wonderful it was when he had grown up in the way that we just discussed in these mean streets of New Orleans. And he had seen throughout his life, even when he was at the top of his profession, he had gotten pushback from white America saying, you're great on stage, but we don't have to recognize your basic humanity. And yet he saw the best in not just the people that he was working with as a musician, but in the world at large. And he truly believed that it was a world that needed a huge amount of improvement, but that it could be a wonderful world. And he was enough of an optimist that he wanted to look at the things that he had seen that worked well. How a kid like him from New Orleans who had nothing could go to Chicago and discover that he had musical talent and have the world discover him and his musical talent, and then could go travel the world, not just in luxury, but as an ambassador, an informal ambassador sent by the US State Department around the world, including to Africa and to the former Soviet Union, representing the best of America. And it used to be said at a certain time in the 1940s and the 1950s and through the 60s that the two most recognizable American cultural figures in the world were Mickey Mouse and Louis Armstrong, not in that order. And the guy who could do all that he managed to do saw that it really could be a wonderful world. And I think his optimism is important, not just because it said something about him, but it said something about that whole generation that had grown up in a segregated world, but could see what could happen with even basic civil rights being granted, and had helped not just be observers of that process of a civil rights revolution, but write the soundtrack for the civil rights revolution the way that I think Ellington, Basie, and most of all Louis Armstrong did.
I need to say in the book that uh, they got some criticism from Miles Davis for their way they had navigated their race. Could I say, is that accurate to say? Could you talk a little bit about that generational conflict?
So, Carolyn, you're exactly right, and I think you're being polite. The criticism they got was being called Uncle Tom's and Aunt Jemima's. They got scathing criticism from the beboppers like Miles Davis and from lots of young Black activists of that era who didn't understand what, not just where they had come from, but that they were the grandfathers of the civil rights movement. And if I could tell you just one story that I think captures that, and this is a story again about Louis Armstrong. The year is 1957, and for while your listeners and viewers, I'm sure, are very smart and very versed in American history, let's remind them that 1957, the signature civil rights struggle in America, was in Little Rock, Arkansas, where a federal judge ordered 9 Black kids to integrate the all white Central High School in Little Rock. And these kids were essentially not just up against the history of segregation, but they were up against a racist governor of Arkansas named Orville Faubus, who said essentially, over my dead body will our proud Central High School be integrated by Black kids. And Louis Armstrong was staying at a hotel when a young reporter knocked on his door and said, Louis, I wonder what you think about what's going on in Little Rock. And this was Armstrong's chance to push back not just against what was happening in Little Rock, but against all the young activists who were calling him an Uncle Tom. And he let everybody have it. He said he called the governor of Arkansas a word that I won't say in this polite company here today, but it began with M and it ended with R, and it got translated in family newspapers as an uneducated plowboy. He called our war hero president, Dwight Eisenhower, who had refused initially to send in the troops to protect those kids, he called him a gutless so and so. And essentially, the newspapers and the critics who had been calling him an Uncle Tom the day after he let loose with this reporter started calling him an unpatriotic American. And he basically couldn't have it right either way. Either he wasn't doing enough or he was doing too much. But there was one person more than anybody who listened to and took to heart what Lewis had said, and that was the occupant of the White House, Dwight Eisenhower, who was a great Armstrong fan. And I think, and I can't prove this, I can't prove the cause and effect, but I think the reason that shortly after Armstrong said those things, the reason that Dwight Eisenhower sent in federal troops to protect those 9 kids who became known as the Little Rock Nine was because his pal Louis Armstrong had called him out for being the gutless guy that he recognized that he had been, and things got better in Little Rock after that.
That's incredible how Louis Armstrong influenced the president in that way. And I love that story when you tell it in the book. As a writer, and I think maybe you can identify with this. This is a college reporter, right, who goes to get this few lines from Louis Armstrong. He's probably quaking in his boots just going there, and then he gets the scoop of a lifetime. His editor says, "I'm not so sure." He was pretty skeptical. He has to go back to get Armstrong to sign the copy to prove that he meant what he said. And as a writer, I can imagine. I mean, I remember like the first time I interviewed Amy Goodman, I was like, the microphone was shaking in my hand, and she was so sweet to me. But I just can imagine how terrified he must have been. And then he ends up with this history changing story.
So that is all totally true. And it also says something additional about Louis Armstrong. The idea that Louis Armstrong, one of the most recognizable Americans on the planet, the idea that he took the time to sign his name when the reporter was made by the editor to come back and get a verification that Armstrong really had said this and said it on the record. The idea that Armstrong took the time to confirm that he had done that said to me about a character who was empathetic enough that he could relate not just to what he was saying and how earth shattering his comments would be greeted as, but that he also empathized with this poor young reporter and did all that it took to let him get the scoop that he had rightfully earned.
Yeah, it's a great story. There's so many great stories in your book. And I wanted to go back. You mentioned Armstrong's travels, that all three men traveled extensively and brought brought an awareness to where they traveled, and also they experienced different treatment that I think changed them. Can you touch a little bit on Ellington and Basie's experiences traveling the world?
Sure. So let's go to one place where the at a moment when the Duke Ellington band was the most popular big band in America, um, the Ellington and the orchestra were going to Lynchburg, Virginia. And I think this was late 1950s. And these are not so far away from a civil rights era. And they go to Lynchburg, and the manager of the band is having a difficult time finding a hotel that would let them spend the night there. No Pullman porter car waiting for them. And finally, Ellington's manager goes to one hotel and talks to the owner, and the owner says, "Sure, I will let Duke Ellington and the band stay here tonight, but of course they have to pay twice the normal rate." And the manager says, "What do you mean, twice the rate? What's going on here?" And the hotel owner very calmly explains, when a black man would sleep on a set of pillowcases and sheets in my hotel, I of course have to burn them the next morning so that whites will feel comfortable sleeping there. So of course I have to charge you twice the normal rate. And that was the kind of reception while he was topping the charts, when he was out there on the road, and Ellington was on the road 300 at least of 365 days a year, which is what it took to keep the band together and to keep money in everybody's pockets. He was out there on the road having to suffer the kinds of racial affronts that just make me embarrassed for what our country was like in that era. And it was not just in the South, it was in the North. Racial segregation may not have been a matter of law in the North, but it was sure as heck a fact. And it was a fact to the point where Count Basie, one night when he was out performing at the biggest venue in Philadelphia, in between sets, he would like to go out and smoke a stogie and just relax in front of the theater he was playing in. And this night, a white guy comes by when he's standing out in front of the theater and throws him his car keys, assuming that the only reason a black man would be at that theater was because he had to be the valet who was parking cars. And again, this is the kind of thing that happened all across America. When Count Basie would go to Las Vegas, his name might be there on the nightclub on the marquee because he was the lead in whatever entertainment they had there, but he could only get in through the kitchen because that's the only place blacks were allowed to enter the casinos. And his buddy, Count Basie's buddy Frank Sinatra, when Sinatra would invite Basie to come and be his band in Vegas, Sinatra would assign one of his bodyguards to Count Basie with a very simple instruction: anybody gives the Count trouble and you break their knees. And that was, I didn't know until I was researching this book what a civil rights pioneer Frank Sinatra was, and I didn't know what a great friendship he had with Count Basie.
So Europe, what was it like when they traveled to Europe or other places?
So when they first went to Europe, and that was the first place all three of them went because it was the place that had the biggest venues and had the most interest in American music and especially in jazz. When they went to Europe, they got a reception like they had never seen in America. They got rave reviews, they got sellout audiences. Queen Elizabeth would go to hear them, all three of them, at the biggest and best theaters in England. And they got such warm receptions that all three of them at different moments debated, is it worth going back to America? Why should we have to put up with all the guff that we take if the Europeans are going to greet us the way they do? But as I mentioned earlier, that in the 1950s and into the early 60s, from Eisenhower to Kennedy, America was engaged in a superheated Cold War against the Russians. And there was a sense that we were in a competition for the unaligned nations to go with either us or with the Russians. And so the conventional ambassadors that we sent all across the world, and especially to places like Latin America and Africa and Asia, that we were trying to pull into our camp, those ambassadors were only successful to a limited degree. And what they smart people in the White House and in the State Department recognized was if they sent out jazz musicians, and it started with Dizzy Gillespie, but three of the most popular were Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie. If they sent out these guys and their bands around the world, that we could win this battle for soft power, the battle that we seem to have thrown up a white flag on these days as we're decimating the ranks of our foreign service staff, but that when they went to Africa, when Louis Armstrong went to Africa, the abiding image in my mind is when he was in the Congo, lifted up on a makeshift throne and treated like the king that he should have been treated as. They were greeted, they had sellout audiences, not just across Africa and Latin America and Asia, but when they went behind the Iron Curtain, they were drawing audiences that were embarrassingly large, embarrassing to the Soviets, and wonderful for American diplomacy. And when they were asked, the way they were at every press conference they held in every country they went to, when they were asked about race relations in America and said, isn't this the reason that unaligned and poor nations should disparage, should give up on America and go in the Soviet camp? They gave the perfect diplomatic answer, which is yes, race relations need a lot of working on in America, but they're getting better. We are working on it, and our freedom still trump anything that the Soviets can offer you. And it was the perfect, unrehearsed, and pitch perfect answer to be given to get Africans and Latin Americans and Asians sympathetic to what was going on in America and have them fall in love with Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie.
Thank you. That was a wonderful answer. I wanted to come back to something else you said that surprised me. We're talking about segregation and integration. There's a part in the book where you talk about how integration among the band was so feared or unwelcome that some lighter Black members of the band would need to put on a darker face with makeup so they were more obviously Black. So you have Black men having to be more Black because it's so scary that they might be seen as white men with Black men.
So that happened. It also happened that they were told that their racially integrated band wouldn't be allowed to play in venues. They were told in other places that they were trying to play that the venue itself, the theater, could have no blacks in it or could have blacks only up in a separate and segregated area in the faraway balcony. And the one who was the pioneer here more than anybody in America or in the entertainment industry in America was Count Basie, who in 1945, just as World War II was ending, had put into his contract everywhere he was going to perform that unless his band could be integrated and unless the audience was integrated, you would get no Count Basie and the band. And these guys opened up the world to the notion that you could have an integrated orchestra and you could have an integrated theater and the sky wouldn't fall. And this was, in a very profound way, a way of making the case for a more racially tolerant country in a way that I think struck home. And Carolyn, if I could tell you what I think was going on, how these guys had an influence on civil rights that was profound. And again, I can't prove this because I couldn't get into the head of everybody I'm about to tell you about. But I think what happened was that white women of that era, and again, that era is from the 30s into the 60s, white women of that era, if they saw a black man walking toward them down the sidewalk, would walk to the other side of the street. And yet, when they got into the privacy of their own living room, they would kick off their heels and dance to the toe tapping music of the Count Basie Orchestra. And they used to say in that era that if you were listening to the Basie band and your toes weren't tapping, you ought to go to the doctor the next day because something was probably anatomically wrong with you. That white men in that same era who would never have let a black man cross their threshold were wooing their sweethearts with the music of Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong. I think what was going on is that in a racially divided world, for once, when people were listening to the music of Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie, and they were generally in that era listening on a record player or on the radio, so you couldn't see the skin color of the musicians. For once, race was falling away, and all they recognized was the genius of the music that they were hearing. And I think it wasn't too big a jump from the fact that these geniuses deserve something approaching equal rights. And so don't believe me when I say this set the table for what happened in the civil rights movement. Believe Martin Luther King Jr., who in a little notice speech in the late 1950s delivered in Berlin said that if not for these jazz musicians, if not for these black men, that the civil rights movement would still make progress, but it would take a whole heck of a lot longer. And he understood that you had to culturally prepare people for something like racial civil rights laws before you could politically convince them.
And I love that moment in your book when Dr. King meets the Duke
Hmm.
and they embrace, you say, like they've known each other forever.
Exactly. And it was like they knew each other. They really did. So certainly Duke Ellington knew about the great Martin Luther King, and certainly Martin King knew about the great Duke Ellington. And the fact that they had lived in worlds that were so attuned to one another, the fact that they hadn't formally met didn't matter. And they embraced, partly it was as if they knew one another, and partly because they both so appreciated what the other one had done in a struggle that was a joint struggle.
You go out of your way in the book to point out that these three men were not perfect. You have a whole section of your book about, well, basically their flaws and quirks. You get pretty personal at times. Why was that important to you to have this whole section of your book about their frailties and their humanity?
So, if you promise not to accuse me of promoting other books of mine, I'd like to answer that question by going back to two other books that I wrote. I wrote a biography about a childhood hero of mine named Robert Kennedy, and that is Robert Kennedy Sr. And even though he was a hero, or more importantly, because he was a hero, I felt I had a responsibility to not just present the good in him, but to look for all sides of him, to make him into a flesh and blood human being with his faults and with his upsides. I wrote a biography about somebody who was a villain to me when I was growing up, and that was a guy named Senator Joseph McCarthy. And yet, unless I could find some things to say about him that explained why half of America fell in love with him, I felt like I wouldn't be telling the full story. So I found things about McCarthy and his World War II heroism that I think suggested that this guy had some upside. The same way with these three musicians that I was writing about, I felt like I was important to say they aren't saints, and they sure as heck weren't saints, and to look for some foibles with them. And I want to say that all three of them were what they would have called God fearing men. They believed in God. They read the Bible, and in Duke Ellington's case, he said he read it 3 or 4 times, cover to cover. And yet, all three of them regularly violated at least half of the commandments among the 10 commandments. And the one they violated the most to me became my the lens to understand their foibles. And that was the commandment to honor your spouse. And all three of them committed adultery often enough that it suggested that, at least with this commandment, they couldn't seem to pull it together. In the case of Louis Armstrong, he was married 4 times, and even with his fourth and cherished and longest lasting wife, Lucille Armstrong, he regularly cheated on her to the point where she would use it if she wanted a renovation of her kitchen or some new expensive clothing. She would use his latest infidelity as a way of ensuring that as the price for letting him back into the house, she would get what she wanted from him. With Count Basie, he was only married twice, but he cheated on his beloved Catherine Basie, who was a gem of a woman, who was actively involved in civil rights and a million community activities, but who, in a series of letters that I got a hold of, threatened not to let Bill Basie come home unless he put all of the family's assets into her name and into their daughter's name, because she didn't trust that he wouldn't someday take off with one of those other women he was having an affair with on the road. Duke Ellington was only married once, and he stayed married for his entire life to the same woman. But he only lived with her as a husband and wife would live together for 4 or 5 years, around the time they were having their only child. And in his case, he stayed married because he realized that he had so many girlfriends, all of whom wanted to be the next Mrs. Duke Ellington, that if he would tell them that he was already married and they didn't want him to be a bigamist and they didn't want him to have to give up half of his assets to his wife, he used his marriage as an excuse to keep at bay all of his mistresses. And all three of them justified their infidelities, much of the way the Kennedy men that I wrote about justified their infidelities. We're on the road, we've got an incredibly busy life, all of these things. And I don't buy any of it. I think that there are plenty of people who spent time out on the road, but still knew what it was to stay faithful. And this is one area where all three of these guys, in my mind, fell short.
But there was more than today a double standard in that era of, the boys will be boys. Um, if you had a daughter, you wanted her to be a virgin. If you had a son, you wanted to practice birth control. So there was that.
So there were, you described it as double standard. I would say double standards. There were endless double standards. There was a double standard that if any of these women had ever been involved with another man, that would have been grounds for divorce. But the men could get away with doing what they did. There was a double standard of the press who were covering them, the same way as the media who were covering politicians like the Kennedys, who felt like that was something that they winked at, but they never wrote about the infidelities, that was just off limits. And there was the more, to me, tragic double standard that there is a reason my book is called The Jazzmen and not The Jazz people or the jazz women. And it is because incredibly talented female jazz performers of that day couldn't make it as instrumentalists. They couldn't make it sure as heck as band leaders because they faced a double whammy of racism and sexism. And the only role that was generally accepted in that era for jazz women was like the great Bessie Smith or Billie Holiday or lots of jazz entertainers. They were accepted as vocalists. And even black men like Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie referred to them disparagingly as canaries or thrushes because they were vulnerable to the same sexism that the world was back then. But there was one woman who was an exception in that era, and that was a woman whose name was Lillian Harden. And those were her first two names. And if I stop there, probably nobody knows who she was. But if I said her third name was Armstrong, that she was Louis Armstrong's second wife, Hot Lil in the Hot Five recordings, the famous jazz recordings that Louis made, she was the piano player, was a brilliant instrumentalist. She could compose and arrange music like Duke Ellington did, and she was a band leader. And she was an extraordinary musician, was an exception to all the rules of racism and sexism. And I think she deserved equal billing to Louis when they played together for those formative years in Chicago.
You even go to the dictionary at one point in your book and point out that jazz men is a word in the dictionary, but jazz women is not a word in the dictionary.
Yes. So the dictionaries, to me, dictionaries are wonderful reflections of social norms. And the idea that we would have a word for jazz men and not for jazz women, or for Pullman porters and not for porterettes, the women who worked on the railroad alongside the porters, is just a reflection of the fact that that is how the people who were governing the norms of America back in those days, they put those built-in biases into, of all places, the dictionary.
Yeah, that surprised me when you reported on that, the dictionary part and the jazz women. And I was actually surprised that jazz men was a word in the dictionary.
Yeah. So both surprised me, and neither of us probably were old grizzled reporters, and we shouldn't be surprised by anything like that. But it was surprising and disappointing, yes.
So, I wanted to talk a little bit as we wind down here about what you think are the most important lessons that the jazz men teach us today in 2025.
They teach us the lesson. I don't know about you, but when I was in my fifth grade civics class, I learned that Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court decision, led to Brown versus Board. And I learned probably five other decisions on the way there. And I learned that things happened in America in terms of social change in a straight line. And I don't think that's the way it happens. I think it happens that the Supreme Court makes its decisions at a moment often when they feel the country is culturally and politically ready for those decisions. And by performing as genius artists, these three black men made it easier for the Supreme Court to give us Brown versus Board. They made it easier for Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and all the other great civil rights leaders to get laws passed that changed American legal standards. That I think that social change happens in a very zigzaggy way. And in a moment where some of us are distressed about what's going on in America, I think also I keep harking back to the words of Martin Luther King, but they could as easily have been the words of Duke Ellington or Louis Armstrong or Count Basie. Martin Luther King said, "The arc of history bends towards justice." And what I think he was saying was that we will have lots of progress and then retrenchment, but over time, we end up, the progress is what dominates. And that is what these three jazz guys believed in to their core, and that is what they made happen. And I said when we started out our conversation here today, I said that I don't think your readers or listeners needed a book from me to tell them about the brilliant music performed by Ellington, Armstrong, and Basie, but I want them to go away with a lesson that there was another half to their legacy, and that is the half that transformed America in terms of its attitudes about race. Race remains the all American story, and these three guys helped in a very fundamental way writing that story.
Larry Tye, thanks so much for joining us today and sharing your book, The Jazzmen. I recommend it, and I can't wait to read Riding on the Rails next. And now I also want to read Satchel and Bobby Kennedy.
So I appreciate your smart questions, and it was a pleasure being with you.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too.
Bye. Welcome, Maryam. Thank you for joining us today and bringing us another episode, another segment, rather, another segment of Poetry Sustains. And you have three poems for us to look at today.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here and eager to get started with the poetry.
Okay, let's start with Billie Holiday.
Sure. Let me go to the Padlet and Billie Holiday changed some lyrics in this song. It was written by Abel Maripol, but she made it famous, and it became a signature song of hers. She was the first Black singer to be backed by a white orchestra, and this song was one of the ones she began singing in her repertoire starting in 1940. Here are the lyrics. Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth, scent of magnolias, sweet and fresh, then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot, for the trees to drop. Here is a strange and bitter crop. Maripol wrote this after witnessing lynching in the South, and Billie Holiday was no stranger to such events. And listening to her sing, which I highly recommend you do, makes the piece come vividly and disturbingly alive.
I was reading in this biography that is to the right of the poem about how people were nervous in 1939. She was singing this song as a Black woman in public. So I just want to read what it says here. I think this is from
Oh, cool.
Wikipedia. She said that singing it made her fearful of retaliation, but because its imagery reminded her of her father, she continued to sing the piece, making it a regular part of her live performances. Because of the poignancy of the song, the founder of the cafe in Greenwich Village, Barney Josephson, drew up some rules. Holiday would close with this song. The waiters would stop all service in advance. The room would be in darkness except for a spotlight on her face, and there would be no encore. During the musical introduction, she stood with her eyes closed as if she were evoking a prayer. 1940. I mean, that's just some radical stuff.
Wow. I did not know that, Carolyn. How dramatic and how appropriate.
And how brave.
Yes.
She was so brave to do that.
She
And written by a white man who was a communist,
the the very best kind.
the very best kind. So, but made famous by Billie Holiday. So famous, Bob Dylan said it was one of the most influential songs that he'd come across. And in 1999, Time magazine called it the song of the century.
Yeah, and sadly, it it still has a resonance today that makes it relevant and timely.
Yes, sadly.
Sadly,
Okay, Billie Holiday. Let's look next at, um,
you wanted "We Wear the Mask" by Paul Laurence
yes,
Dunbar.
Paul Laurence Dunbar. Yes.
He wrote before the Harlem Renaissance, but his work was incredibly influential. Half of his work was written in dialect that makes people cringe a little bit these days, because they worry that it's caricature. But uh, he was an extremely gifted poet in formal terms as well. And "We Wear the Mask" is a good example of that. We wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile. With torn and bleeding hearts, we smile and mouth with myriad subtleties. Why should the world be overwise in counting all our tears and sighs? Nay, let them only see us while we wear the mask. We smile, but oh, great Christ, our cries to thee from tortured souls arise. We sing, but oh, the clay is vile beneath our feet, and long the mile. But let the world dream otherwise. We wear the mask.
Yes, Larry Tye was telling me that the Pullman porters would say that they had to wear a mask on their job or they could end up in serious trouble. And reminded me of this poem right away. I don't remember how long ago or where, but I saw a video of Maya Angelou reciting this poem.
Oh my goodness.
It was so powerful, and she got
I
her,
bet.
her big smile, um, that grinning smile. It was just so eerie. I'm gonna try to find that. I'll send it to you.
Yeah, I would love to see that. I would love to see that. She was uh, quite a spokesman for American poetry during her life.
Mm.
I think the part that speaks the strongest to me is "With torn and bleeding hearts, we smile." That we pretend that everything is okay, that we're happy, that things are not weighing us down. That's just
I
devastating to me somehow.
I can see that. I think my favorite part is myriad subtleties because
Yes.
those for whom they were wearing the mask did not think that they were capable of myriad subtleties.
Oh, yes, that's true.
So those wearing the mask had a whole language for one another, a language which they said they could put down. They could put down the mask and be their full selves when Duke Ellington would come back from his concert and play for them all night long. And they could be themselves, but they could show those myriad subtleties openly and not just mouth them in a way that their audience was oblivious to.
Have you read James by Percival Everett?
No, I think you were with me when I bought that at Literati, and it sits on my shelf. But it's on my to-read list, but
The things that
not yet.
happen with public and private speech in that novel, which is sort of the story of Jim, the character in Huckleberry Finn, but told from Jim's point of view, are very reminiscent of this poem. There's a public elevated discourse for private, and then a shuffling, friendly persona that they put on when dealing with white people.
Okay, I'm going to try to take a break from my work reading and read that soon.
Yeah, I think you would really like it.
Last but not least, one of my favorites.
Oh, is this one of your favorites?
It has always been one of my favorites.
Oh my goodness, that's great.
It's interesting here that the title is We Real Cool, but then is that a subtitle that I don't remember seeing in anthologies?
Yeah, it is a subtitle. And after Gwendolyn Brooks' death, Terence Hayes, among other contemporary American poets, it said, okay, let's have the golden shovel be a new form in American poetry. And usually they start or finish with lines from Gwendolyn Brooks' poems.
Oh, I did not know about
Which
this.
is, what greater tribute could there be? Yeah.
Mm. So, what is the golden shovel?
I think it's a pool hall. There's pool players, and then 7 of them are playing at the golden shovel.
I see. Okay, go ahead, my dear.
And she steps into the persona of the young men, the young boys that she's concerned about. We real cool. We left school. We lurk late. We strike straight. We sing sin. We thin gin. We jazz June. We die soon.
Mm. All these small words and not very many of them, and such a huge story told by them.
Oh, and the repetition of the pronoun at the end of each line until that last line.
And there's no
I
more
think
we. Yeah.
shows her diving into what she thinks is their persona or their sense of themselves for having skipped school and playing pool in the golden shovel. Because
Mm.
she's very concerned about them, as you can tell.
Yes. They think they have it all figured out.
Well, as young people, we often do think that, don't we?
Yes. I read somewhere a long time ago, I don't remember where, that Gwendolyn Brooks was a housekeeper for a white family. And when she won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry, she found out she won and then went right to work as this family's maid. That she didn't take time off. There was no little celebration at the time. You heard that?
No, I did not know that.
And it's a I would need to research it, but I remember probably in grad school when I studied a lot of poetry. I think that I heard that.
Wow. You can tell from the dates of her birth to death, she lived the longest of any of these writers, and she was incredibly prolific. Um, I don't think she kept on housekeeping for very much longer after she won the Pulitzer, but I would have to go and do some research to piggyback and find your story there.
Yeah, let's find out if there's some truth to that story, if I'm
It's a
just,
great story.
yeah, it's there probably is, or I don't think it'd be something I made up. Oh,
Well,
thank you so much for sharing these three, finding
you're
them and
so
sharing them with
wonderful. I'm
us.
always glad to be invited to be here.
Let's stop our share and say thank you again. And you'll be
Yes.
back soon with another segment of Poetry Sustains.
Thanks so much, Carolyn.
Thank you, Maryam. Have a wonderful day.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks to Larry Tye, author of the Jazzmen, for joining us today. Thanks also to Maryam Barrie for another powerful segment of Poetry Sustains. This podcast is produced on the sacred ancestral land of the Anishinaabe people. Thanks to the California band Castle House for writing and performing our music. Thanks to our underwriter, Just Play Productions, and to our paid Patreon members for their support of today's podcast. If you'd like to offer your support, please visit my website, whimsyfarm.net, and click the Patreon link to find a level of support that's right for you. There is also a free membership level. You can email me through the website as well. That's whimsyfarm.net. The Whimsy Farm podcast airs the 1st and 15th of each month on our YouTube channel, Carolyn Crane and Whimsy Farm, and wherever you find your favorite podcasts. You can find links to audio and video and Patreon, all at whimsyfarm.net. Be sure to join us on August 15th when we welcome author Barb Barton and discuss her book, Manoomin, the Story of Wild Rice in Michigan. Until then, remember the words of Utah Phillips, who said, "Too many good people are doing too many good things to afford me the luxury of being pessimistic." Get out there and create some positive change. Stay safe, everyone.
whimsyfarms.net